Okay, we are recording. Welcome to Talk with History. I am your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jen.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights into our history-inspired world travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. Now, tonight we don't have any guests, but we are talking about our most recent video, and that is the video on the Loving couple.
Yes.
So, Jen, why don't you give us like a quick background on the Loving couple, or kind of why we decided to do this one?
So it kind of was a perfect story to tell at the perfect time. It's the week of Valentine's Day, and it's Black History Month.
Yeah.
So the Loving couple were the face of the landmark Supreme Court case that allowed interracial marriage to be legalized in the nation.
Yeah, and I actually remember you had dug up this particular history case because their hometown is not too far from us, probably a few months ago.
Yes.
And I had kind of written it down. And when you told me a little bit about that story, I was like, oh my gosh, from a storytelling perspective, this is such an incredible story because they have all these ups and downs and what they go through. So give us a little bit of set the stage for us on this couple.
So Central Point, Virginia is kind of how it sounds. It's like the central point of Virginia. It's square in the middle.
Yeah, it really is.
Of the state. It's very rural.
We show it in the map. It's like the closest thing is Bowling Green.
Yeah, Bowling Green is the closest city. Sparta is kind of like a city.
It's what, like an hour and change from Richmond?
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just a rural area. Like really it's just two roads, a church, a country store, and a school.
It is out in the middle of nowhere.
Out in the middle of today, there's not even the country store. So it's pretty much rural in the middle of nowhere. And at the time of the Lovings, in their youth and living there, this is around the 1950s, it is a very racially integrated town. The people did intermarry there, and they basically just minded their own business. And they had always kind of lived that way. And Mildred and Richard, Mildred's real name was, her maiden name was Jeter.
Right.
And there's a lot of Jeters in the cemetery. You can see their names. And her mother's maiden name was Bird, B-Y-R-D. And there's a lot of Birds in the cemetery as well. And that country store was owned by the Bird family. So Mildred and Richard are both kind of from a long familiar line in that area.
And it's a beautiful area. Like we were driving out there and we were talking on the way out. It's part of one of our favorite things we get to do on Walk with History is drive to some of these more random locations because it was gorgeous country.
It was gorgeous.
I mean, it's out in the farming country, and I believe one of the clips we put in the video was some old news clips from the 60s and 70s. And I think actually that kind of the intro for our video is one of the news clip intros from 1967 or 68.
Yes.
And the news person says she's the daughter of a sharecropper,
Yeah, she's a daughter. So again, they've had long family history that lived out there. And like I said, people pretty much interracially married there. So really they didn't think anything of it.
Yep.
And so when they fell in love in high school. They decided to get married in June of 1958. And you couldn't get married in Virginia, though, because of the Jim Crow laws if you were interracial. And this is because there was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 made it so your birth certificate and your marriage certificate had to have your race on it.
Oh, interesting.
And so they made sure, and it really was to protect white, right? Because there's only two categories. You could be white or colored.
Right.
So if you weren't white, you were everything else was colored. So Mildred is not just African American, she's a Native American.
Right.
And that is if you go to the cemetery like we did, they have their tribes
I think I missed that.
tombstones.
Oh, cool.
And so it's a very Native American area as well. And that really is what she identifies more as. An American Indian, she actually will say that. Like she really doesn't identify as African American. And so, but because you only are two races, colored or white, if they were going to try to get married in Virginia because of that act, you couldn't get married because of what is on your birth certificate.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I kind of knew happened, but I didn't know much about the laws or the state specific laws, right? And that at that time, I mean, this wasn't long after was Brown versus the Board of Education.
That's 1955.
That's 1955.
So it's
this
3
is
years later.
Three or 4 years later,
want to get married,
right? So a lot of these laws, people don't realize that these things are kind of sticking around,
Yes.
and especially in some of the more southern states.
Yeah, people are digging in their heels. They
Yeah.
don't want to change, and so June 2nd, 1958, they drive to Washington D.C. and
Yep.
get married,
Yeah.
and come back down to Central Point, Virginia, to live their lives. And it's a little over a month later, July 11th, that the police raid their house.
Yeah,
I mean,
that was crazy.
they opened now people didn't lock their doors, but they opened their doors, come in, and like try to catch them in bed in the act.
Yeah.
But they're sleeping because it's like 2 a.m,
Yeah.
right? And they're married. So who's doing that at 2 a.m. when you're married? You know. So
Yeah,
and
that's a great point. We're tired.
I know. And so they shine the flashlights on him, and they're like, you know, you can't be in here together. You can't be cohabitating as a married couple. And Mildred points to their marriage certificate. It's framed on the wall, and they're like, that's no good here. And it's because they're trying to be married, cohabitating, they are arrested and they're taken to prison. And what's very interesting at the time is Mildred's actually pregnant at the time.
Yeah. So actually, I didn't realize that until we watch Mr. Beat's channel.
Yeah.
Right. So not Mr. Beast, the big YouTuber, but Mr. Beat, the historian. So it's a very large channel. After you watch this, I encourage you to go check it out because he does a great job on a ton of stuff.
Yeah, he does. He really is hitting Supreme Court cases, and because this is a Supreme Court case, he talks about it in that lens. We try to tell more of the story of their life with the Supreme Court
Yeah,
case.
and their story. I mean, if you haven't watched our video, this is honestly probably one of my favorite videos that I've made in quite some time because I think it's just such a powerful story.
It is a powerful story, and so when you think about a woman newly pregnant in prison, you would think they would want to get her out right away, but that's not what happens. Richard is bailed out right away, and the judge keeps Mildred in jail for 2 more days because they're afraid they're going to cohabitate again.
Right.
And so they don't want her to be bailed out and then go back to her husband. So they allow her father to bail her out under the stipulation that she won't go back to the house with him.
And we even show a news clip. Now, obviously, this was after everything was successful and their case goes all the way up to the Supreme Court. She even says to the news people that said, they had gotten like a bail bond company to bail her husband, Richard, out. And the bail bond company told Richard, hey, if you try to bail your
wife out,
Mildred out, we'll put you back in.
I know. And I look at Richard's face when she's telling that story because to me, it seems very crippling as a man who's trying to take care of his wife, right? You don't want your wife in prison and you're free and you're told, well, if you try to get her out, we're going to put you back in prison. It just, so I just really love the Lovings, and I know that's funny to say, because they're very unassuming couple. They're not looking for this publicity. They're not looking to be the face of the Supreme Court case. All they're looking for is to live their lives in peace. Yeah. And this is what it's going to take. So in January of 1959, they go to court for this arrest, and they're found guilty, and they are ordered to 1 year in prison, or they can leave the state of Virginia and not come back together for 25 years.
Yeah. I even when you kind of told me that part of the story and I was making the video, it was so hard for me to process, right? And I guess maybe that's because those of us nowadays, or the large majority of folks living in the United States, like can't fathom a law like that, a restriction like that, like the hatred like that.
Yeah, the hatred like that. So they move to Washington, D.C., and they get a small apartment. But the law kind of watches them and it's a game of cat and mouse. Mildred will come back to Central Point to have her baby, and Richard will come back to be there with the birth of his child. And it's right after they have the baby, they're arrested again. And so then they go back to D.C. And so it's very much like they this is their family. Like I told you, they're very rooted in this area. They try to come back for birthdays and holidays, and it's very much the police trying to catch them. Like that's what they're very occupied with.
Because all their I mean, both of them have long family ties in the
Yes.
area.
So it's in 1964. Mildred is just, I mean, she's depressed.
Yeah.
She misses her family.
They're living in D.C.
They're living in D.C. They're living in a small apartment. Richard is a bricklayer, so he's getting work, but it's hard work. And their kids don't have any space like they have in Central Point, Virginia, to run around and play in the yard or in the fields.
Yep.
And so their youngest son is playing out front and gets hit by a car. And he's not injured, but it's enough to send Mildred over the edge, where she writes a letter to the Attorney General of the United States, and that's Robert F. Kennedy.
Yeah.
And Kennedy gets this letter, good on him, and forwards it to the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union. And they do pro bono legal work that is going to forward the constitutional rights of America. Yep. And it gets into the hands of 2 lawyers in Alexandria, Virginia. And Cohen is kind of like the face for those two.
Yeah, and that was one of the cool things that I like making about these kinds of videos that are a little bit more recent history, because you can find news clips of everybody. So if you haven't watched our video, if you're listening to the podcast, definitely go watch the video, because you get to see Richard and Mildred talking. You get to see Cohen.
Yes.
We don't have clips of him talking. I didn't play those, but you get to see all these old news clips of this stuff happening.
Yeah.
Right? And some of it I was able to pull. There was an HBO special, kind of like a documentary made on it not too long ago. So they had kind of aggregated some stuff. So I pulled bits and pieces from that, and then some from the actual original news clips that are floating around on YouTube.
Yes.
It was so it's really neat for me as a video maker to be able to see these people, and it really kind of makes the story that much more impactful.
Absolutely. And you get to see them both. Richard is he's stoic, he's quiet.
Yeah.
He doesn't say much. Mildred is the more outgoing of the two, and that says a lot because they're both not outgoing. She's also quiet, but she's well spoken. And she's beautiful. She's very slender. And together they make a very, I guess, a loving couple. They're not very demonstrative, but they sit very close to each other, and they are supportive of each other as they speak.
Well, they're not very demonstrative, like when the news media is around.
Yeah.
Because they had the reason we had all these news clips is because there was a news camera at their house,
Sure.
in their kitchen,
In their face, yeah.
And there is some clips of them outside of some of the courthouses. They didn't end up going to the Supreme Court.
No, but so what happens, the Cohen law firm files a motion right away to vacate their prior conviction. So they can go back to Virginia. And he does it through the Virginia Supreme Court. And that happens in 1965. And that is why we go to Richmond, Virginia in our video, because the Virginia Supreme Court is in Richmond, Virginia. And there is a marker there to, memorialize this case. But at the time,
when we were there,
they're doing construction on that side,
literally
of
right
the court
between
building?
the two buildings where the marker was supposed to be. The construction zone is right between these two buildings.
And they took the marker down, accordingly, because they're fixing, and they just lean it up against the building, the court building, but in a location that you really can't read it or see it. They could have made it a little closer to the gated area where you have to walk.
We actually had to walk around the block
once
or twice.
We saw it. We're like, that's
we actually
loving.
went. There was a park on the other side, and so we actually asked these cops that were over there with their police
Canines,
dogs.
yeah.
And we were like, hey, do you guys know where this marker is? Like, are we allowed to go in that construction area? Because I think I finally spotted it.
Yeah.
So I finally spotted it, and we're like, are we allowed to go in there? And the cops were looking at us like we're kind of half crazy.
And we're like, we have a history channel. All we want to do is video the marker.
Yeah, we're not even allowed to kind of really go in there. I think if it's gated off, it's gated off.
I know.
Like, dang it. And
Just
so
history.
We were walking around, which actually we found some other cool stuff that we'll probably show some clips from, like on Instagram and stuff like that.
Well, it's the capital of Virginia, so
there was some other really neat stuff there. But eventually we found like a good vantage point to get a good shot. So we got a shot of the marker leaning up against the courthouse. And then
we do a great comparison about leaving their rural roots to fight the big fight in the big city,
Yeah.
in the urban jungle. And so we do that kind of talk. So what happens in the 1965 Supreme Court case is the judge upholds the guilty verdict, but he vacates their 25 years living outside of Virginia. So they're actually able to move back to Central Point, Virginia. So even as the Supreme Court case goes to D.C., they're back in Virginia.
Oh, I don't think I realized that.
So that is why, and they don't go to the Supreme Court case, but Cohen goes to see them in Virginia. And he asks Richard, is there anything you would like me to say to the judges of the Supreme Court? And that's when Richard will say, tell the judge I love my wife. Like, it's so simple to him. It's so basic to him. I love my wife and I want to be married to her legally, and I want to live with her and have no issues with us being arrested for just trying to live a normal life. And that is so powerful that in 1967, when Cohen goes to argue this case in front of the Supreme Court, it's a unanimous decision. And what I think is important, these are all white male judges.
Yeah, older.
And they all vote in favor of striking down the law and making interracial marriage legal nationwide.
Yeah.
And they use the 14th Amendment, the equality for everybody, and that race is too subjective to limit someone in marriage. And so there's mostly the southern part of America had still upheld interracial marriage laws. But once that is decided by the Supreme Court, the legislature doesn't fight back, of course, then all those laws are overturned.
Yeah, so there was, I think we said in the video, there was 16 states that had laws like that at the time that were basically overturned by what the Supreme Court said.
Yep.
Obviously, in practice, that probably took a little bit longer. But I'm not me personally, I'm not too surprised that the Supreme Court justices that were there did overturn it, because if you think about it, these are probably all the same folks who just did Brown versus Board education.
Yes.
So that's the it's civil rights era.
Yes, it's
right?
still
And actually, by the time it gets to them, we're almost on the other side of the civil rights era.
Sure.
Not completely,
Yes.
but it's 67. It's not the late 50s.
Yes.
So this has been going on for about 10 years.
And so the case is decided June 12th, 1967, and since then, June 12th has become Loving Day.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
Yeah, so if you ever want to celebrate Loving Day, it's June 12th, and that is the day that, interracial marriage was legalized in the nation. And of course, we talk about this. I don't think we talk about this in the video, but Mr. Beat does. This is going to open the door for other equality marriage laws in the nation. Now, Mildred and Richard will move back to Central Point. He will build her a house. Yep. The house still stands today. It's on Passing Road. We didn't quite make it to the house. It is still being lived in.
We missed it. We were looking around for the description, and it was actually a little bit further away from the church.
Yes, but it's on Passing Road.
Then we realized.
And it's interesting that passing is the word for the road there, because passing is another term that's used if you are light-skinned enough but still have African-American blood, you can pass for white. So that's what that term is sometimes used for. And it's interesting that that's in Central Point, Virginia, and these are people who are interracially marrying. So that's kind of like interesting that you'll know when you hit that road passing in Sparta. But it's not too long later in June of 1975 that Mildred and Richard are driving close to home, and they're hit by a drunk driver.
Yeah.
And Richard will die in the accident, and Mildred will lose her right eye. But Mildred will never remarry, and she will forever live in that house that Richard built for her. And then she succumbs to pneumonia in 2008. So we were lucky enough to visit their graves.
Yep.
And they're buried, is it St. Stephen's Baptist Church, and that's in Central Point, Virginia. And right across from the church is the graveyard.
Yep.
You can't miss it. And you can tell that this is a family graveyard. There's a lot of Jeters and birds. And
and it's not too far. You can actually look up the Loving couple historic marker that's on one of the main roads. And it's actually from the marker, right? I'm pretty sure you can Google it. And actually what I'll do is I mark these on like a Google map.
Yes.
And I'll share that Google map page.
Yes. I think it's Sparta
link.
Road.
Right.
That takes you all the way into, when you hit Passing Road, that's when you know you're in Center
Yes,
Point.
you could probably look up where the marker is. And like I said, I'll share the link in this video description to the Google Maps link, and you'll have like a little map of where that is, those couple points are. And from there, it's basically like 10 miles.
11.
11 miles.
Yeah.
It's straight in. It says it right on the marker. So it's actually not too difficult to find.
No, and they put historic markers on more well-traveled roads. And so this is like Highway 301. It's Richmond Turnpike.
Yeah.
And so this is like a busier road. And so if you can imagine, it takes you 11 miles from that busier road because that's how rural the area is.
Yeah.
But it was just an honor. Like, I really felt it was important to tell this story at this time in the month, and just to bring recognition to them. They seemed like a couple that really didn't want the recognition. Scott had alluded to it. Time came out after the decision was made and did a whole photography session with them and recorded them. That kind of got their faces more into the media, and people got to realize more about this case. But they really never wanted so much attention, but they were proud of what they had done. And even Mildred, at the end of her life, always was very proud that they had fought for their marriage and for their love.
Yeah, and this was such a fun story, and again, I encourage you, if you're watching the live stream or if you're listening to the podcast, after you're done here, go and find the video. It's not a super long video, right? Even just like tonight's live stream, this is a shorter live stream for us because it's a quick and easy and successful and happy story to tell. But the things that they dealt with, right, being falling in love, and then they can't get married. So they go somewhere else to get married, right? They hit the high, and then they come back, and a month later they're arrested for being married, right? And they hit a low. And so then they leave, and they're living together, and it's another high, and then the sun gets, so it's this up and down story. And the one thing they do to persevere is that they stay together. And then finally they write the letter to the Attorney General and connect with the ACLU, and their court cases eventually carried on. And they even talk about like, hey, I wouldn't, I think Richard even says in part of his interviews is like, they said that we wouldn't really understand what was going on at the Supreme Court, so we didn't go.
Yeah, that's what he said.
I don't know if I really wanted to go. They were like, I'm too nervous.
And
and the reporter asks them, like, do you think this brought you closer together? And both of them, like, neither of them answer right away. Like, they're very soft spoken.
Yeah,
both of
she
them.
goes, I think so.
I think so. She's like, she looks at him. She's like, well, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think for the most part, they were close before the case happened.
Yeah.
It might have brought them closer, but I think looking at them too and their answer that they gave, they were pretty solid before the case even happened. So, I think what's the most incredible part is their last name.
Yeah. It's almost like there's no way this story is real, but it's true, and it's one of those ones that I think they were the couple that this was meant to be, right? They weren't over the top. They just like, hey, we just want to live our lives, and so it was truly an incredible story.
I think for me too, not being from Virginia, and you always hear the slogan, Virginia is for lovers.
Yeah.
I think for me, it gives new meaning to that slogan now.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for listening to the Talk with History podcast. And please reach out to us at our website, talkwithhistory.com. If you know someone else that might enjoy this podcast, please share this with them, especially if you think that today's topic would interest a friend. Shoot them a text and tell them to look up the Talk with History podcast, because we rely on you, our community, to grow, and we appreciate you all every day.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you next time.